Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar brought to you by TechStrong. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I will be moderating today's session. We have an exciting presentation ahead of us today, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the discussion, it will be made available to rewatch. You will receive an email after the webinar concludes with a link to access the on-demand. We want to hear from you, so please feel free to send in your questions at any time throughout the program by using the Q&A tab. We will try to address as many questions as we can, so please send them in early. We also encourage discussion by using the chat tab. Please let us know your thoughts, your comments, suggestions, or just say a quick hello. Finally, at the end of today's webinar, we have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Stick around to see if you are one of our 4 lucky winners. Now let's go ahead and kick off our webinar today. Our topic at hand is Reducing Enterprise Open Source Management Risk in the Financial Sector, Part 2. I'm joined today by Murali Kaundinya, CTO of Wells Fargo, Anders Wallgren, VP of Technology Strategy for CloudBees, James McLeod, Director of Community at FINOS, and Rhys Arkins, Director of Product Management for WhiteSource. So I'll go ahead and I will turn the program over to our 4 presenters today to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Murali.
Thank you, Cody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to give a brief introduction of my mandate at Wells Fargo. So I am responsible for platform architecture, which is in the enterprise architecture organization in the office of the CTO. And that responsibility entails driving platform thinking, cloud adoption, modern, application development practices, etc. So spanning from CI/CD, middleware, hosting, cloud adoption, SRE, and event management, I cover the gamut as it pertains to architecture and driving thoughtful deliberation in terms of introducing practices, keeping in mind that developer productivity, risk mitigation is of paramount importance to the bank. So that's my brief intro. Cody?
All right, Anders, let's hear from you now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anders Wallgren. I am the VP of Technology Strategy here at CloudBees. And I've been working for the last, over 15 years in the DevOps space, primarily around orchestration of sort of some of the more complex activities that organizations go through as part of their software delivery life cycles, and with a particular focus on what needs to happen in regulated industries. So finance, obviously, being the primary one there. And it's been a very interesting journey. I mean, just seeing the difference that the community has been able to make over the years, and also now it's kind of exciting to see that some of the best practices that are being that have been kind of introduced and followed by regulated industries now sort of widening out to the broader software community, just even beyond those. So those best practices are being promulgated pretty effectively, which is good. We've got a long way to go, but excited to be here and to talk to everyone about it. So it's nice to be here.
All right, and James?
Hi, Cody. Thank you for the introduction. So welcome, everybody. I'm James McLeod, FINOS Director of Community. And as you might be able to see, through the window behind me, I'm actually in the City of London, which is really great because us over here in the UK have actually, opened up from COVID, and we're able to go around and say hi to each other, which is actually super exciting. So I actually represent FinTech Open Source, where we're bringing banks, financial companies, tech vendors, consultancies, and people who want to learn and also contribute into open source in finance together in order to get code and also thinking into repositories that are actually out in the open. And so if anybody wants to take a look at FINOS and what we do, you can find us on GitHub at github.com/FINOS. Feel free to come in and take a look around.
Excellent. And Rhys, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Cody. So my name is Rhys Arkins. I'm Director of Product at WhiteSource. At WhiteSource, we focus on what's known as software composition analysis. You can think of that in simple terms, knowing what open source goes into your product, and more importantly, knowing if there's any problems you should be aware of. I came into WhiteSource somewhat as an accidental security professional. I had a passion for tooling and automation, and built a tool in the area of dependency automation. And it turns out that there's no better use for dependency automation than automatically staying free or getting free of vulnerabilities. So I still maintain a deep interest in the belief of developers in automation as a kind of approach to having a great security posture. And my role at WhiteSource is to be responsible for the developer integrations, which we have as part of our products.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for those brief introductions. I'm going to go ahead and just turn the program over to you guys and let you get it kicked off however feels natural to you.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, but I'll jump in first with a question to my fellow panelists here. So Murali and James, we chatted some months ago. I forget exactly when. It was earlier this year, part one. And the first topic in the session today is the threats and attack vectors financial institutions need to worry about most. So I was curious, is there anything that is worrying you more or less these days? Are there any topics in the area of fintech, open source, or security which you think are of particular importance? And of course, Anders, you can jump in as well anytime you want. So Murali?
Yeah, great question, Rhys. Since our last panel discussion, the threats are not reducing. If you noticed what has happened with SolarWinds and large enterprises like Microsoft really taking the heat on the attack surface that they're exposed to, the importance of shifting left and fortifying the ways in which we source all of our dependencies, as well as our posture towards building secure containers and moving to the cloud. This topic is ever more important. When you really look at the statistics of the number of open source components and the versions that get built through the forges, etc., that's just exponentially increasing. Championing developer productivity and championing reuse requires us to really have an open, posture towards evaluating the software and thoughtfully bringing it in, not to introduce any kind of risk. So that requires, the platform infrastructure to make the, extra investments to optimize developer productivity with risk mitigation. Particularly as we go towards the cloud, the posture that we tend to take is we want to abandon some of the anti-patterns and the practices that have been suboptimal in the past, and we may set the bar very high, but that might really make it harder for application teams to move to the cloud. So we really have to be very pragmatic, not to reduce the bar in terms of what you really bring in, but also really put in the right enablers to motivate cloud adoption and app modernization. So that's where I've been spending a lot of my time on.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that, Murali. And so Rhys, I want to kind of answer that question with, some things that I've actually noticed and, have hit the headlines that I would imagine the majority of people who are actually on this webinar would have seen. So this is actually outside of financial services, but it does, bring to life the reason why we need to keep an eye on, what people are doing and what we're consuming, and really bring engineers and, security engineers together. And that's all of the ransomware attacks, that have actually crippled, certain infrastructure within the US. And also the ransom attacks that have happened. And it might have happened, before the last time that we spoke, but it certainly affected me through Garmin, because I couldn't go out running. I couldn't even log, running, 5K because all of their maps and, all of their navigation systems were encrypted and, they were held to ransom. And
at least you would have learned your way around the block, though, James, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But when these things are real, and the way that a lot of the malware actually comes into the system, is through malware, being installed on somebody's local machine, which just so happens to be on a network that is connected to some form of server somewhere. And then whoever is doing these attacks, they're in, and they're then asking you for money. People aren't able to get gas at the gas station. Infrastructure is offline for a period of time. And so when you actually see all of these things kind of hit the headlines, it kind of brings it back down to earth that we need to be vigilant about how we're constructing our software and how we're scanning, and what questions that we're asking and what policy should be in place. So I'm not going to say I'm all over security, because Rhys, you are all over security, but I'm actually kind of like a massive advocate of making sure that engineers who understand their subject matters are speaking to people and leading the charge, and kind of having oversight on what people are doing who may need to be educated in that way.
Yeah,
and
so it's kind of front of mind, right?
Yeah, and that's certainly the same, within the open source landscape, within financial services, which I'll talk about later, once we've given Anders a go at introducing, his point of view on it.
I mean, it's interesting because I think, in some sense, finance is no different from any other industry or organization when it comes to software security and so on, with the exception of, as the man said, Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. But from a software and technology perspective, it's the same vulnerabilities in the same code being exploited by the same people. So it's really, it's a software industry wide problem. And it's going to be a cat and mouse game forever and ever, right? There's no end to this, right? There's no we're gonna once and for all make software completely secure, and we're never going to have ransomware again, and we're never going to have exploits again. We're never going to have vulnerabilities again. That we can get better at this, but there's no end point. There's no terminus to this. This is a process that we just have to continue to go through, get more diligent at, get better at. Educate everyone on, and I think that's probably the best way to sort of move forward is awareness, tooling, better processes, obviously more automation. I mean, I speak as an automation vendor there, so I'm a little bit biased on that point, I suspect. But it's not unique to finance. It's not even unique to regulated industries. It's more visible, right? Because the results are so spectacularly bad. But as James points out, it can happen to other industries as well, and it's only going to get it's probably going to get worse before it gets better, right? And I'm actually a little bit surprised that, given the fact that everyone has sat at home more or less, or at least the ones that have been fortunate enough to be able to sit at home in the last year and a half, that we haven't seen more problems, right? Because I can't imagine that every organization out there that all of a sudden had everyone working at home, that they were set up to do that securely, that they had the right policies, that they had the right setup on all the on everybody's home computer that they were all of a sudden using to connect to the corporate network to get their business done, and those sorts of things. So to some degree, I'm a little bit surprised that it hasn't gotten worse over COVID due to those sorts of things. But this is just something that we have to continue to be vigilant about, that we have to continue to invest in and raise awareness of, because it's not specific to finance. It's more visible in those sorts of scenarios, but we're going to see it, only get worse if we don't pay attention to it.
So you apologized for raising automation, but automation is key. It's absolutely key. There should be absolutely no apologies for raising that.
I retract my apologies.
Yeah, retract it. Don't apologize for automation. Automate everything.
Yep.
And automate it as early as possible in your kind of development cycles as well. Get those checks in. See what you're consuming and see what you have, within your pipelines, for sure.
Yeah. One of our it's interesting, Murali, you mentioned the notion of shift left, which I think is it's a heavily used term, but for a reason, right? It makes a lot of sense to talk about that. one of our customers in the finance industry has an interesting approach where they sort of self-audit their teams a little bit and assign them what they call a shift left score, to sort of figure out, okay, where are you on the, and I hate the phrase sort of maturity level or maturity curve and those sorts of things, because I think they're too trite and formulaic and so on. But they do pay attention to, what are the important things that you need to do. And, one of the things that they look at, for example, is, okay, you say you're doing the scanning. So you're attesting to the fact that you're doing that scanning. And by attesting, I mean, literally, like, raise your hand and swear that you're doing it, right? And I think what a lot of us are doing, what they're doing, I suspect, most companies are starting to do this more now, is we don't trust people to say that, right? What we want to do is we want to actually do the automation around, for example, that security scanning, so that not only do we have evidence of the fact that it happened, but we have concrete evidence that, for example, we use the right configuration to do the scan, right? Because who knows who went in and, all of a sudden changed the configuration so that we're doing less scanning or more scanning or the right kind or wrong kind of scanning, those sorts of things. And then also that the results, that we paid attention to the results, because a security scan, as I think we all know, and this is sort of part of the beast, is they typically spit out a lot of vulnerabilities. Some of them are high sev, some of them are low sev, some of them are false positives, some of them are very relevant. And only by going through the results and processing them and thinking about them is the scan actually doing you any good, right? The scan by itself doesn't mitigate, it doesn't fix. All it does is kind of raise its, wave its hand and say, hey, you have a potential problem here. So I think by the industry a little bit moving away from this notion of, hey, I signed on a piece of paper here, I promised that we did the scan, and instead going with the automation and sort of the deep evidence-based automation of, here's the configuration we used, here's the output from the scan, here's where we process that output, and at least made a decision that this thing we're going to take care of, this thing we're going to ignore, here's why. Those things. So I think we're getting deeper into that, which is
traceability and accountability is very important. In a way, dare I say it, to avoid security theater, where people are just ticking the boxes and
Exactly.
Yeah. For me, one of the things that I've found interesting related to open source security since we last chatted is really this continued formalization of the concept of the software supply chain and the threats to security as part of that. Obviously, it wasn't brought up this year, but we're seeing it come up more and more. Murali, you mentioned SolarWinds, for example, and on that note, so last week, there was Supply Chain Con, first ever, as part of KubeCon, and someone from SolarWinds actually gave one of the most impressive presentations there, in my opinion, and it was on the steps that they are taking to try to detect and avoid supply chain threats these days, because clearly there's a lot of pressure on them. And so it's really interesting to see that type of stuff, because they're already doing things that almost no one else, none of us, perhaps even on this call, are doing to avoid that, because the bar has been raised, so high for them. But what's interesting about supply chain threats is that, although you mentioned, Anders, so that banks is where the money is, right? And we talk about fintech. What's interesting is the willingness for attackers to take these indirect routes there. So when they attack a supply chain, they're not necessarily saying, well, that's because this leads to Wells Fargo or something like that. They may not know where it leads, but they've got confidence it leads some good places, so that you could say that they're trying to ride the rainbow to the pots of gold. And it's interesting because different companies need to have a different kind of security posture in that relation, because say Wells Fargo, you're the pot of gold, but say CloudBees and WhiteSource, we might be the unfortunate rainbows in that equation. And it's a different way of looking at things.
I think that you're absolutely right, Rhys, and I think maybe as we're kind of like engineering in open source, and a lot of the libraries that actually get engineered, they do kind of accumulate, and they become part of the dependency tree that gets used, in lots of different places, within finance and also outside of finance. We need to make sure that our maintainers are aware of all of the various different checks and balances they need to go through to make sure that they don't accidentally become a vulnerability. So yeah, and so we're talking about shift left inside banks, and when we actually talk about that, we're thinking about the feature teams who are sat around the table, kind of trying to get things moving quickly using lots of different automation techniques, lots of different DevOps tooling, implementing DevSecOps, providing evidence to regulators. We now need to kind of like start educating, the people who are starting to become part of the open source industry too, about how they look upon themselves and, what's their own personal, security posture. Are they using two-factor authentication in order to keep themselves safe, within their own profiles, wherever they're committing their code? How are you kind of scrutinizing the code that actually gets committed into your repos? There are tools that can help mitigate that, and there are tools that you can actually, use GitHub Actions to apply, against the dependencies that you're bringing into your own products or your own project. But, as an engineering industry across the world, everybody needs to have, their eye on security, and also be aware that, the risk is there, and it's not necessarily a banking risk or, a regulation that, some regulated industry requires. It's a risk that all engineers everywhere need to be aware of. Security is a part of engineering, just in the same way as, writing, JavaScript is a part of engineering. And so, yeah, you bring a great point, so that's my point anyway. So if
actually, James,
if there are any...
If I can bounce it back to you right away, though, because it's something I want to chat with you about. So, FINOS, for those not aware, joined the Linux
Rhys
Foundation.
There? Or is that me?
It's probably just you, because I can hear Rhys.
Oh, sorry, James, you don't hear me?
No, we can. You were buffering just a little bit, so you might have to just go back 10 seconds.
My apologies. I was just going to say, FINOS, for those who aren't aware, joined the Linux Foundation. I believe it was last year. It's hard to, years blend in these days. But now one of your kind of sibling foundations is the Open Source Security Foundation as part of Linux Foundation. And I think that must be a great kind of benefit to you in FINOS as well, to be able to complement your own, personal interests in security with having people within the same kind of parent organization pursuing those things. Because you brought up about, apps and tools, and the Open Source Security Foundation has introduced the concept of a scorecard to help open source projects to be more aware and we'll say be more compliant with best practices for security, and with the help of mostly Google, I believe they've turned that into an app as well that open source projects can kind of install for like an automated scorecard assessment of how they're doing. So I think, I assume being a part of that, shared foundation must be a strength for you within FINOS.
Oh, absolutely. So we joined the Linux Foundation, and as you can see, I actually work for the Linux Foundation. So that means that FINOS is now a sibling of all of these other Linux Foundation projects, such as CNCF and also OSSF, so the Open Source Security Foundation as well. And we're leveraging a lot from the Linux Foundation. I mean, the Linux Foundation now supplies, a lot of the infrastructure that we're actually leveraging in order to automate ourselves as, as FINOS. And we're starting to kind of, get to know all of our other brothers and sisters within the Linux Foundation. And the Open Source Security Foundation is one of them. But the same is so with the CNCF as well, and how, leveraging CNCF and, all of their networks and all of their engineering capabilities can also help projects within FINOS like cloud service certification. Because at the moment we're focusing ourselves, in that Kubernetes area. And because we do have that kind of internal network within the Linux Foundation, one related to security, as you just mentioned, and the other one related to cloud native, we're saying, okay, so how can FINOS, who works within a regulated industry, has great relationships, with banks across the industry, how can we help you get more contributions into the CNCF, and how can you help us get more contributions from your side into FINOS, for cloud services which are regulated. And so that cycle and that circle of like a networked Linux foundation certainly is apparent, and we're starting to really feel it as well, especially since in London, maybe a week or so ago, we had our own open source strategy forum over the Monday and Tuesday of last week, where some of the other Linux Foundation people also came because it was OSPOCon as well. So we had the FINOS members meeting on the Monday, OSSF on the Tuesday, which is the open source strategy forum, and then OSPOCon, which is another Linux Foundation conference for open source program offices. We were all kind of like networking as Linux Foundation colleagues and kind of exchanging ideas and saying, how can we actually work with the to-do group? How can we work with the open source security foundation? How can we work with CNCF? And so it is bringing all of these groups together. And I'm hoping as director of community, for some reason, it's like the Matrix. I can see how these kind of like threads join together. I'd like to start, kind of pulling on those threads and bringing people in and, exchanging ideas and, leveraging materials that exist and that are mature, and also contributing, materials from FINOS, such as open source readiness, across the Linux Foundation. How can we help with that across, all of these various different foundations? But yeah, you make a good point. It does bring a lot of weight and a lot of advantage, and a lot of reassurance that we have those subject matter experts, in that open source network.
Yeah, and Anders mentioned earlier about finance in many ways is not being particularly, different or unique. It's the same software, it's the same vulnerabilities as everybody else, and I don't object to that at all. James and I actually were chatting earlier in the week along very similar lines, but what we were trying as an exercise almost to think about was what areas though do need to be thought about differently when you are in either high regulation or high risk like finance. I thought, Murali, you might be best to answer that one. So, given the baseline that yes, you are ultimately consuming the same open source, it's the same vulnerabilities and things like that. Where do you think that you and Wells Fargo do need to think differently about risk, about open source and security compared to, say, if you're in a, if you didn't have so many pots of gold, let's say?
Well, I look at it in a couple of dimensions. Historically, we have resorted to the scrutiny, that you can afford by having dedicated security architects look at your bill of materials to see whether that is safe enough for the firm to deploy something into production. And as you can imagine, with our very large portfolio of software that we develop, that can really put a lot of pressure because you can't possibly hire that many number of security architects who would really know the nuances of various vulnerabilities and the various languages and so on. It's very difficult to keep up. So, to Anders' point about automation, we basically said, look, architecture and the review, that is a safety net, but you really need to use those resources, thoughtfully. So throw automation to protect the ingress. Like, how do you really source it from the outside? Make sure that what you're really bringing in is safe from a licensing perspective, as well as, thoughtful awareness of all the CV, ratings, the, vulnerability scores, etc. Well, now we are looking at another dimension because you can't just be satisfied with the CV scores. You need to look at the lineage as to what are all the places, through which that open source is kind of exchange hands. So one of the things that I'm encouraged with the Open Source Security Foundation is that there are open source efforts. I'll throw in a plug for Graphias and Critis. Graphias is a Google-sponsored open source effort that gives you APIs for tracking the metadata of all the vulnerabilities that is there in your software. So if you're really bringing in, your transitive dependencies, you now can use an API-based approach to look at the metadata, and then you can decide whether you want to accept the risk or you really want to be more aggressive addressing it. And then as you deploy this into containers, there is another offering called Critis, which allows you to do the attestation of what exactly have you accepted from a risk perspective, so you can really prevent or evict certain pods that might be deployed in Kubernetes if you find that you have since discovered more vulnerabilities since your last known scan. So OSSF is not just lofty, in terms of its goals and so on and so forth. It is also matched with pragmatic tools that will really allow us to implement the kinds of scrutiny that we really want, so we can really protect the firm in a meaningful way without hurting developer productivity. So that's what I'm really excited about.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing is that software is being delivered faster than ever. From an old time where you might used to release, software once or twice a year, to companies embracing sprints, to the type of software where some companies or teams and companies literally deliver multiple times per day to production. While at the same time, I doubt many people would disagree that the importance of security and compliance has only gone up because the threats have gone up. So this is a real like a wedge that some people get in. There's been a lot of talk. Well, I guess once you're doing that, you clearly have to do as much as you can earlier in the software development lifecycle, and that's led to discussions and previous webinars and future webinars about developer first security, developers taking over security. But I'm a personal believer that most developers don't want to be burdened by security, and they certainly are not interested in manually tracking down and tracing security, except when it's really important. Anders, as you mentioned, you come from, from the automation side, and so I'd love to hear your take on where you think automation has the ability to kind of reduce that burden, that manual load. We talked in the abstract here about developer burnout potentially. So how do you see that going? And also interested, if you have time, on the role of like CI versus more like CD. Like what can be put earlier in the CI versus the big stuff which maybe still has to be run later as like a gating check before release.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one of the themes around automation is make the right way the default way, make the right way the easy way, and as much as possible kind of remove the cognitive burden from the team to remember to do things, and to remember to do things correctly, and to remember to do things at the right point, and also give the team the ability, and I'm speaking somewhat abstractly here, but I'll get a little bit more concrete, but give people the ability to sort of move around where things happen in the timeline of the life cycle, and which generally we're going to talk about sort of shift left, but there's other important aspects to this, right? Because I think it's a great idea, but I think it's a great idea that developers get more invested in the security of the products that they work on. But that's not sufficient, right? Because not all vulnerabilities are known before you go into production. So if unless we say, all right, now developers are in charge of all operational aspects and those sorts of things, which at that point is sort of a semantic argument. But you have to continue to monitor, and you have to continue to do scans and check for vulnerabilities after you go into production, because we can go back into the world of, and nobody's suggesting this, but we can go back into the world of, we only release software once a year, and that's going to, and I've heard people say this, not very much recently, to be honest, but and we're going too fast, and the reason we have all these security problems is because we're going too fast, and if we slow down and take our time, that'll make things better. And I think that's just a blatantly wrong argument in terms of if you're only used to releasing once a year and you have a vulnerability in what's released, are you really going to wait another year to do a release, right? No, of course you're not. So the faster you can go, the more agile you are, little a agile, in terms of your ability to patch, your ability to find, discover vulnerabilities and address them, and then get the mitigation out into production. The faster you are at that, the better off you are from a security perspective. Because really, the name of the game here is not to, let me rephrase that. The name of the game here is as much to fix things after they're discovered in production as it is to prevent things from going into production, right? You need to do both. There's, you can do all the scans in the world before you go into production. You can do all the static code scanning, dynamic code scanning, dependency scanning, all of those sorts of things. And that's never going to discover things that aren't known yet, right? So that job doesn't end once you go into production. Not, nobody's saying that that's the case, but you have to think about it in those terms. And I think when it comes to, so that's a little bit of a partial answer too to the notion of how much of this do you do in CI versus how much of this do you do kind of in the CD or the release orchestration aspects of the process. And I think there's some pragmatic answers to that question, right? One is, if you're doing something in your release process that is fast to do, literally runs in a few seconds, feel free to shift that left, right? That can probably only benefit you. If what you're doing, however, is an expensive operation and, it's going to take 10 minutes to run, or it's going to take an hour to run, or you need time to digest the output of a particular step that you take, then it's not appropriate for CI, because it's going to slow down your CI cycle time, which ultimately will hurt your ability to deploy, changes, whether they're changes to mitigate problems or new features or bug fixes and those sorts of things. So I think it's the honest answer is it depends. That you really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis and say, look, if it's going to slow down our CI cycle, we probably don't want to push it into CI. We probably want to leave it at, whatever cadence we do releases for, and kind of keep it there. And then one thing I want to...
A ballpark figure? Sorry, do you have a ballpark figure for the approximate time when you think things are appropriate to put into CI versus none?
I think it's very contextual.
10 minutes, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very contextual. In the CI community, you talk about what's the ideal CI cycle time, right? And you really want to, you want to stay very, very quick, 10, 15, 20 minutes. That's what people aim at. Now, what percentage of the industry achieves that? I don't know, but it's definitely not 100%. It's probably not even 50%, right? As soon as you get to the point where you have a large, complex product, or you have a product that's composed of, hundreds or even thousands of services, it gets a little bit trickier to do that. So it's contextual. And I would say that the answer to that question is going to be relative to where you are today in your cycle times, and also relative to where you want to be in your cycle time. So if you're running, just for example, if you're running an hour-long CI process, because that's where you are, for whatever reason, then adding another hour to that by adding a scan is probably a bad idea, right? Unless, and then you also have to think about, well, what percentage of my CI cycles end up going into production? And if I do 100 CI cycles by the time I go into production, that's one thing. If I do 2 CI cycles by the time I go into production, that's another thing. So it's very contextual. And I would say, bias it in favor of shifting left as much as possible, but keep in mind the realities and the constraints and the facts on the ground of how you operate.
I think that might
like you brought up
think about this as well, which is between CI and CD, you really need to have a common set of data structures, because as you very well know, WhiteSource does this with the software composition analysis. You really create a signature of what constitutes your release, and what you want to be absolutely certain of is the release that you deployed into production is immutable, and there is no residual stuff that is really getting picked up in the environment that you're really running. So if you can be absolutely certain, using common data structures, semantic versioning or calendar version, whatever it is that you really have the means to uniquely identify that binary release that you really deployed into production, and work your way to really see, open the hood and tell me what is the software graph. And then you can figure out what are all the vulnerabilities you have since discovered since the last known good scan. So you can then really figure out, if you did find out something that has gone bad, you really have the means to surgically replace or trigger a rebuild process, etc. That's where I believe enterprises ought to be highly standardized. So you really want this to be done consistently across the operations team, and having that common vocabulary and nomenclature is really going to be a huge prerequisite.
I mean,
I have a topic that spans. Sorry, and it spans the last two things you said, because I'll go back to the earlier question about what's changed. Actually, SBOM. I forgot to mention that one. SBOM is really a big thing recently. And but then really you're talking about the scanning there, and actually this is something that WhiteSource we've been talking a lot with customers about, because although there is not at the moment a strong pressure to be delivering on SBOMs, there's a bit of a misunderstanding, almost an incompatibility with the way a lot of people previously thought about their software, because people are used to scanning earlier, and that's great. But they don't understand that if you've got a completely separate build and release process, that what you scanned earlier, whether it was CI or even post CI, like scanning on your main branch, if you still go and later do a completely fresh build and release, then the SBOM you think you have and that you might be declaring to people won't actually match in some cases what you're actually shipping. So there's this need for this kind of forensic step now, not just best effort, but forensic step of SBOM that occurs very late, post build, pre-release, in order to get the exact dependencies. And of course, that's only going to help it make you more secure as well, as a nice kind of byproduct. But the driver for it really is people understanding their obligations in terms of SBOM. Sorry, Anders.
Yeah, no, I mean, test what you build, deploy what you tested, right? I mean, that it's kind of straightforward, but more difficult to achieve than you can't just say it and magically it happens. So you kind of have to go through that. And I think the software bill of materials is a big deal, because knowing what you have in production, knowing what you have in flight, in staging or in development is very important. John Willis tells a great story about the Equifax incident a number of years ago and contrasts their behavior with the behavior at I believe it was Fannie Mae. In the U.S., one of the large sort of pseudo-governmental mortgage companies, and the how they behaved, those two organizations behaved in light of the vulnerability, and I believe that was in the Struts library at the time, was completely the opposite. Fannie Mae shut down their publicly facing applications until they were able to determine whether and where they had the vulnerable library deployed, right? Whereas, well, we know what Equifax did and didn't do, so I'm not going to go into that too much. But it's a study in contrasts, and John Willis tells a great story just of how, and this gets to the other C word, in addition to community, culture, and the importance of having good culture around these kinds of practices. Where in Fannie Mae there was an individual who stuck their hand in the air and said, we need to fix this. We need to shut down. We need to make sure that we know what we have in production. We need to make sure that we mitigate this very quickly. And literally over a weekend, I think they went off and did that, contrasting that with Equifax. So the cultural practices around this and the, not having fear to raise your hand and say, oh, I think we need to be careful here, or I think we really need to pay attention to this, and kind of not be, slapped upside the head for taking those kinds of steps. That particular example, I think, goes right to the software bill of materials angle, which is, okay, vulnerability, here's the version that it's in. Is that anywhere in our supply chain? Is that anywhere in our production systems? Is that anywhere in our life cycle at the current moment? And what, if anything, do we need to mitigate that? It's incredibly important. It's the same as, you think about the food supply chain, you think about the water supply chain, you just have to pay attention to every little bit of it, and you have to know, you have to have sort of lot numbers on everything that you produce, so that when you find a problem, because there will be a problem, right? It's not that the security that we apply to the food supply chain gets rid of all the pathogens in the world, right? That's not the point of it. The point of it is to know when we find a pathogen in the supply chain where it's gone, right? And it's the same with software. The point isn't to get rid of pathogens. The point is to know where we have points of vulnerability in those things, and the software bill of materials is incredibly important for that. And as Murali talks about that sort of transitive closure of what all your dependencies are, you need to know that, and it's not enough to know just sort of what's in your Maven POM file, right? Because that doesn't tell you all the all the dependencies that those dependencies depend on. So that transitive closure is very important, very important.
So it's really interesting.
The old statement. Oh, sorry, the old statement or joke about no one wants to know how the sausage is made. And I said, Phil, well, the thing is, like, it goes a little bit for software. People tried to take a blind eye, but anybody who builds software needs to know how their software is made. So, sorry, James.
No, it's absolutely right. And I was going to come back on what Anders was saying. Firstly, about culture, and then making sure that we don't slow down in order to keep ourselves safe. We find better mechanisms and processes, and working together in order to actually speed ourselves up. So leaping this back round to kind of like open source, within financial services. And this will kind of like tie into what you were saying about, software bill of materials. The thing that I'm noticing is that more and more banks and financial services companies are forming their own open source program offices now. And it may be the case that, banks and, fintechs and, other companies already have these and they don't actually realize it. So I've worked in financial services institutions where you have like COEs. So you'll have, a center of excellence, who looks after your DevOps or your cloud or your software engineering or your testing, and they're all accountable for their, certain aspects, within the cycle of development. And they're also, they also look after, the engineers or the people who belong under that area of development, to make sure that, they're well educated, they're keeping on top of, industry patterns and, the direction of industry. And maybe they come together in different guilds or communities in order to talk through, what they're actually doing at that time and the issues that they're actually facing. These types of groups are now actually being called, open source program office. And it is, kind of a construct within a bank or a construct within an organization, but it just so happens that banking, is starting to invest in this, that is accountable for how open source is actually used, whether that is through contribution, to the outside of the bank, through whatever mechanisms and, governance and policy and CLAs and, licensing, etc. it may be. But then also, how it is consumed and what the landscape of that consumption actually looks like. So going back to the, software bill of materials, what are we actually consuming from Maven or, NPM or other registries that's, making its way into, our bank and then into our software and then down into production. The open source program office, should be the place where either full-time members, form the OSPO, or, part-time members from these various different other centers of excellence kind of come together to talk through what they're noticing. So for me, to have open source recognized by having a physical construct within a bank, which is named after open source, and is also, accountable for understanding the entire landscape of how open source is actually being used, all the way from, your open source readiness and how you actually construct your policies to be able to engage, all the way through to, scanning all of the libraries and dependencies that come into your bank and then finally, go into production. That is just absolutely amazing because it's a complete kind of recognition that open source in finance is there. And in order for it to be recognized, formally within a bank, there needs to be a term for it. And that is the open source program office. And for me, the way that this accelerates you rather than kind of puts the brakes on is that if there are any mechanisms or processes or manual kind of, testing or, raising tickets rather than automated process, for getting things, the open source program office, if you've got the right people talking to each other, can help, kind of streamline that mechanism because there will be the right people in that program office to take that issue back to the center of their COE or the center of their team. And so that is a physical construct, but it's also a massive recognition of open source in finance and also open source everywhere, because it's not, a finance only, thing to be happening right now.
James, I wanted to go back to supply chain security for a bit, because something you said kind of triggered another thought. So you used the word scan at one point, and pretty much a lot of what we've been talking about today, is really talking about traditional SCA as an approach to open source. And this is what I'd call scan and report. You could say, of course, it's scan, report, prioritize, action, but essentially this concept of scanning, knowing what you have. Especially when we talked about like the ransomware earlier, there's a very big difference in some of these threats now, which is that, if you've already got open source on one of your machines and then scan it, if that was malicious open source, it's already kind of too late. So definitely one of the big shifts in our thinking, and I think in our customers as well, is the idea that there is a certain type of, attack vector, we'll call it, where you need to do more than just scan and report. It's shifting really to like preempt and defend. So traditional, although very important, SBOM and scanning and knowing what you've got, very important, but in a way that doesn't protect you against malicious attacks. It'd be like having a virus scanner that lets you download everything and run it, and then later says, oh, by the way, that calendar app you downloaded on Tuesday, that was actually like a virus, like it's not good enough. So and just to put it in some context, I thought about quizzing you all to guess, but I think it would be mean. But WhiteSource at the moment is literally reporting over 100 new malicious packages to NPM per week. 100 per week. Confirmed malicious and removed packages. So the scale of malicious attempts is massive, and these are basically packages that are all attempting to do remote code execution. To the second you install that, they will try to take the environment variables, any cloud credentials that you've got saved and things like that. So in the context of supply chain and ransomware and things like that, this threat is really escalating, and it requires a bit of a different approach to kind of open source security.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the difference between what do you do to waterproof your house versus what do you do when the waterproofing doesn't work. And you need to have a plan for both, because once the water gets in, it's a very different scenario than when you're up there trying to put flashing on the windows and all of those sorts of things. Once the stuff gets in, now it's a different game, and you got to be ready for that as well. And that's probably some of the hardest kinds of things to plan for, because that really is a different story. That's not proactive, it's reactive. And you want to be, probably going to sound a little dumb and trite, but you want to be proactive about what you're going to do when you need to be reactive, and have a plan in place for what you do. I remember back when and this is going way back, but back in the 1980s, when the first internet worm hit, the DNS worm. I was in university at the time, and there was no plan for this because nobody even thought about this, right? So what became the reactive game plan was, well, we're just going to disconnect from the internet, and that doesn't necessarily fix the problem, So you have to have plans for this. You can't just you can't wing it when your calendar app has been there for a couple of days already. And has already implanted the remote execution kit or those sorts of things. So those are two different or slightly different things, but you need to be ready for both.
Yep,
absolutely.
So, we need to invite. Oh, sorry, James. I was just going to say we need to invite Cody back soon, so we don't run out of time. I thought everyone just get a chance. Maybe if we'll frame it, we'll say, what would you talk about on a part 3 if it happens? What's your takeaways, James?
So coming on to what you were saying about, preempting, possible vulnerabilities, it was almost a question back to you. I mean, how would you actually even stop that hidden a firewall? I mean, would you kind of scan registries directly? Would you go into code repos, wherever they may exist, and, kind of take a look at, what project teams who are bad actors are working through? What is that ultra left kind of like, shift that you can do to stop it kind of like even hitting your firewall or even being a request? Maybe we can take that into the next one.
It's scanning packages in real time and making sure that you have the ability for a package manager plugin to actually stop it before you install it. So there needs to be like a check, npm install or bundle install. There needs to be a check at
you
that
don't even
point.
Want that hitting your network. You don't want that going anywhere near your machine.
Yeah.
Or
Exactly.
Should there be a part where the maintainers of the repositories get rid of packages with highly severe vulnerabilities in them, right? I mean, there's a million versions of struts. Some of them probably shouldn't be out there anymore. But
Yeah.
But I think that, but realistically, it's not really the package or the repository maintainer's job to do that in some sense, but maybe it should be, or at least an aspect of something that they do. And then who decides, oh, we deleted your package because there's a vulnerability in there. Like, oh, okay. So that that might be another topic to investigate, is like,
maybe
how far down into the root of the tree do you want to go to sort of uproot the problem?
Maybe part 3 could be an open source maintainer, so project maintainer, who represents something that you would use. A lead engineer, who's part of a feature team who would potentially use that project, and somebody who's accountable for, using that, within a bank or within a financial services firm to say, what those two kind of engineering leads, need to do to make that person, feel safe and, secure in the use of that code. To take it down to the next level and bring, the code writers and the people who are actually hitting the coalface, onto a call and bring them into the panel discussion.
One of the things that we had thought through in the past was whether it would really be feasible to bring in the source code and build it yourself. It's not entirely practical, but that, depending on, what kinds of software that you're really bringing in, assuming you really have the means to have the build machinery. I mean, these days it's, pretty darn, cheap to build that infrastructure, right? It's even available in the cloud, etc. So that would really be a good way to, mitigate the risk, because you're now applying your own gold standard of security to build the software and build your own binary. So that's one approach. If you're a small medium organization, you may not be able to afford it. The other thing that we've also done in the past is discourage the tendency to bring in software from the outside. If you've really done the due diligence to do the necessary scanning, do the necessary verification, having some sort of a clean cache, which is basically your authoritative source of your binaries, and referring to that repository as opposed to your Maven repo approach where you're transitively bringing stuff all the time. Those are all things that would really be moving the needle in the right direction, right? I mean, a combination of those would minimize the attack surface, and then ultimately you would really have greater visibility into the lineage of like where the binary mutated and where it really went through and where the source code commits are. Those things are beginning to become more apparent, right? So if you're really able to source that information and make a good informed decision on what the risks are and whether you want to accept that, etc., those are all pragmatic ways in which you can manage the situation going forward.
Absolutely. And if people have any ideas or any suggestions on how we could take the panel forward, maybe they can join DevOps Mutualization, which is part of FINOS. It's a special interest group that Anders is the secretary of. Or we've also got the Open Source Strategy Forum, which is a FINOS conference in November, the 9th and 10th. And you can find a member of the FINOS team who can then loop all of these questions, back to Rhys and kind of plow it into this panel.
Thanks, James. All right, Cody, I think you need time to announce these winners, right?
That's right. So thank you guys for your time in this presentation today. I know everyone here probably learned a great deal. If there are any questions we didn't get to today, we will get those over to the folks at WhiteSource and they can get those answered for you. A quick reminder that today's session was recorded. So if you missed any or all of the presentation or you just like to rewatch it, it will be made available. Following the webinar, you'll receive an email with the link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section and it will be waiting for you. At this time, I'd like to announce our 4 winners of our $25 gift card drawing. Our first winner is Francis M. Francis M, congratulations. Our second winner is Kevin D. Kevin D. Our third winner is Paul P. Paul P. And our final winner is Tan M. Tan M. Congratulations to our 4 gift card winners. To our 4 panel members today, thank you so much for taking the time to put this together. And I would also like to thank our audience for being with us for the entirety of the presentation. This is Cody J. Brown signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.